back, everyone, from lunch. I hope you all enjoyed a fantastic meal and kept the conversations going. As I mentioned before, that's always, I think, the mark of a good conference, to have conversations continuing and people are discussing all sorts of things that we're talking about in session. So this is our last panelist session today, and we have 3 people that I'm going to introduce you to now. And immediately following their 3 paper presentations, we'll move into the classrooms right along this hallway and then to the right. The workshops, there are 4 of them. They're in classroom buildings 05, 06, 13, and 15. I've already turned on the lights, so you should be able to find them quite easily. When it comes to determining the workshop you want to attend, you only have the opportunity to attend one. So, for example, if you're an Illinois native or someone who's lived and resided in Chicago, you may want to go to Frank Ardito's session because he's going to be discussing how CJAC and YCW operated in Chicago in the 50s and 60s. If you have interest about how to organize with the CJAC methodology, you'll want to go to Teresa, Nancy, and Monica's session. So again, you have to make a very tough choice. But I'm sure all the sessions will be well populated and very interesting and insightful. So to get underway here, first I want to introduce Katie Sellers. Katie is a teacher here locally at DePaul Cristo High School, and she's a soon-to-be PhD student at Miami University in Oxford in educational leadership, culture, and curriculum. Katie is a religion teacher who is dedicated to making college preparatory education available to low-income students. She holds a master's degree in theological studies from the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College. And in August, she will begin her doctoral studies, so we all wish her well on her new journey. Please welcome her to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me, or should I? A little better?
Better.
Okay, great. Thank you all for being here. As I was preparing my remarks for today, I came across this quote by Cardinal Cardine that really resonated with my experience as a high school teacher at a Catholic high school. He wrote that religion should not be outside the ordinary daily life, but rather it should animate and transform it into a truly divine life. Speaking specifically as a teacher of morality, I would go one step further to suggest that the practice of morality should not be outside the ordinary religion curriculum, but rather it should animate and transform it into a truly divine learning experience. I would like to share one such learning experience with you today to illustrate how the Cardine model of moral decision-making can help liberate the morality curriculum from a process of memorization to a formative experience of social change. I will proceed in 3 parts. I will begin by sharing one case from my first year teaching at an urban high school here in Cincinnati. I will continue by highlighting several strategies for replicating a similar learning experience in your own educational ministries. And I will conclude with a brief recommendation based on my experience for developing curricula for secondary religious education, and potentially how that can animate your own ministries and partnering, whether you're in direct ministry or in education. How can you intersect? So I approached my first year teaching high school in the same way that I had been taught, memorization. There might have been some textbooks and lively discussion involved along the way, but when I think back on the totality of my own theological studies, a quarter of a century of them, I was never required to act, only to contemplate. In only one graduate level course was I even allowed the option of a participatory action project, yet even that wasn't required. This was how theology was done, I thought. Paulo Freire would call this the banking concept of education, in which students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. So when I walked into my classroom on the first day of school, I assumed my job was to get my students to know all that I knew. It took me some time to realize that it's not enough for Christians to learn our faith. We must live it. Part of living our faith is being in a community with one another, knowing and loving our brothers and sisters for who they are. This was particularly challenging for me in my first year teaching high school because I came from a different culture than that of my students. I'm white, middle class, and I'm privileged. My students were not. Before I could enter into the See, Judge, Act process with them, a process which requires a great deal of trust, I first needed to see and trust my students for who they were, to understand what or who might resonate with them. And my students needed to see and trust me enough to guide the direction of the class. It took me about 7 months of my first school year and a great deal of listening to my students and my mentors to make some headway from difference to community and then from community to more authentic learning. By more authentic learning, I mean learning that goes beyond the text, learning that is lived in the world. When I think back on my religious education in light of my experience as a teacher, I find it notable that my religion classes in which I was a student were built in the image of the traditional academic classroom, rather than following the footsteps of Jesus, the servant teacher. Throughout Scripture, we see that Jesus, the rabbi, the teacher, isn't just encouraging memorization of the law, but encouraging encounter with those in need, and merciful action toward them based on well-considered interpretation of the law. Let's all read Matthew 25 for a refresher. But Jesus modeled Catholic action before it was Catholic action, and thank God they did. Blending action and reflection, as Jesus did, leads to deeper learning. Learning that can transform our hearts of stone to hearts of flesh. So this isn't just good ministry, but good pedagogy too. High school age students are seeking to make meaning of their lives, socially and morally. And the See, Judge, Act method is an appropriate vehicle for meeting these developmental needs in and beyond the classroom. A transformation happened in my classroom when I first invited my junior students to encounter the story of Tyra Patterson. She was a woman of color who, when she was just a few years older than my students, was wrongly accused and imprisoned here in the state of Ohio. 22 years later, Tyra was still in prison for a crime that she didn't commit, and she was petitioning Governor Kasich for clemency. Tyra was being represented by a legal team from the Ohio Justice and Policy Center, a Cincinnati-based nonprofit law firm which works to advocate for the rights of incarcerated people in Ohio. I invited the OJPC communications manager to be a guest speaker in my class, a visit which had initially been intended to be the capstone of a whole unit on mass incarceration that we had planned together, he and I, using Tyra's case as a personal lens through which the students might see more clearly the challenge of addressing systemic injustice. After the students had spent several classes learning the particularities of Tyra's case, the communications manager, who had also done legal work on her case, was intended to visit class and respond to students' questions directly. And this was the first time that I'd ever used a case-based approach in my classroom, and I was surprised at the enthusiastic response of my students. But I cannot emphasize enough the drastic transformation that they were exhibiting. Tyra's story affected them in a way that no other unit had that year. Their whole demeanor in class changed, where most students had for months expressed a general lethargy in class. They began to come to class energetic, they were excited, they were curious. They were moved by this specific case, and they wanted to know more. By the time that the communications director came to speak, the students had compiled more than 3 pages of single-spaced questions for him to answer, and chief amongst them was, when are we going to get to meet Tyra? A week later, they were doing just that. The executive director of the OJPC, who also served as Tyra's lead counsel, introduced the junior students to Tyra using video conferencing. This was the first time in 22 years that Tyra had ever met a group of high school students. She'd never even had a chance to be a high school student because she had dropped out of school in junior high. And for 45 minutes, she responded to this litany of questions and comments from students, ranging from, how do you keep such a positive attitude in prison, to the promise of, I'm going to pray for you, Tyra. Clearly, these students empathized with Tyra's circumstances. They saw her as a person rather than a prisoner, and engaged her during this first meeting with remarkable tenderness. It was 2 days before I would see these students in class again, and it was clear when they arrived that they had already reflected seriously together on Tyra's circumstances, and they were readying themselves to act. The scaffold for that reflection had been laid through, at this point, nearly 8 months of reflection on nonviolence and scripture, prayer, and virtue. While they had, to this point, expressed a certain apathy about these subjects, now they were seeing the practicality of a faith that taught justice, of a God who came to set prisoners free, and a gospel, the heart of which is mercy. Immediately they asked me, what are we going to do to get Tyra free? The answer unfolded over the remainder of the school year. The students chose a variety of actions according to their interest and their comfort, and they were fully free to do so. I wasn't directing them, you do this and that. I gave them an option. Are you comfortable with these things? And they chose. Some would post on social media. Some wrote letters to the governor or to Tyra. Others continued their research on mass incarceration beyond the scope of Tyra's case. Some even wrote scripts, and they called the governor's office talking directly to executive aides. For all of them, this was the first time that they had intentionally engaged in civic action of any sort in their entire lives. Not one of them had ever engaged in civic action. And yet the students were not satisfied with the limited level of their impact. They wanted to find ways to devote more time to act on Tyra's behalf. And after some discussions where they acknowledged this dual desire to keep on learning about morality, because now it had meaning, while simultaneously working on Tyra's case, they resolved together to pursue this activity as a club after school. The administration affirmed this approach, and so our action continued. We had formal meetings once or twice a week, and informal meetings, more often to work on particular pieces of a larger project that the students were designing. At each of our formal meetings, staff from the OJPC would join us, and as often as possible, we devoted part of our meetings to video conferencing with Tyra. This allowed an authentic relationship to develop between her and the students, and thereby continue this hermeneutical circle that she had inspired. With each new encounter, they shared their ideas and their work with her. And they would often pray together and reflect together, both on their spiritual and their intellectual lives. And Tyra was consistently responding to this by encouraging them in their personal growth, far and above any work they were doing on her behalf. I mean, for her, this was about them growing as people. And this attitude only inspired the kids more. By the end of our school year, the students had shown remarkable gains in academic performance. Further, students had worked together with technical assistance from the OJPC to make a video for the governor in which they communicated that mercy is critical for leadership. And should he make the courageous decision to set Tyra free, he would not be alone. They would support him in this decision. Through this methodology of See, Judge, Act, these high school students had transformed from passive receivers of the word to active and informed preachers of it. I would suggest that this is a method worth repeating. My experience working on Tyra's case taught me several strategies that may help others in implementing this method in the classroom. And for those of you who aren't teachers but are activists or ministers, perhaps this can inspire ways you might start thinking about how can I make myself available to the educators out there. I think both attitudes are necessary as we think about going forward. But I'll share 4 strategies. First, you have to know your students. Listen to their interests and build community in your classroom such that they actually begin to share with you their authentic concerns and interests. I decided to plan a unit on mass incarceration in part because my students had expressed a serious interest in both criminal justice and racial equity. This unit was responsive to those interests and intended to present them with a case that they actually wanted to see. Once we were shifting from that encounter to analysis and action, our community further served to improve collaboration and accountability, including my own accountability to my students. Second, work cross-curricularly, or just find a lot of community partners. But justice issues, we all know, they're not limited to one content area, and neither should your efforts be as you're approaching justice issues through the curriculum. In my school, junior year is when all students are introduced to government, economics, morality. These are all systems level courses which have a lot of intersecting themes. By collaborating cross-curricularly, students can build on existing knowledge and see more clearly how these areas of interest can intersect in real life. Further, you can strengthen your own learning community and sustain your own morale by collaborating with colleagues. I think one of the biggest virtues of this method is that we all need a community of faith to be individuals practicing our faith, and this facilitates that. Third, be creative in the ways that you foster encounter. See, Judge, Act is part of a culture of encounter. And if you are anything like me, you probably have mental limits on just what you imagine facilitates authentic encounter. One of the most distinctive things to me about my experience with Tyra was that the role that technology played in facilitating our relationship. Every interaction that my students had with Tyra happened digitally through video conferencing. This technology is common to all prisons in Ohio, and identical or similar technologies are in use throughout the United States prison system. They are costly, they require significant technical infrastructure, and they are prone to malfunction in the prisons themselves. However, this didn't deter Tyra, and it didn't deter my students from finding deep value in these exchanges. Whomever it is that you are seeking to encounter, as we think about all that separates us from our neighbors, I think it's important that we remember new technologies can foster authentic encounter, so leverage them. Finally, partner with an organization that is working for justice in a concrete way. Or for those of you who are part of those organizations, how are you making yourself available to educators? Do they know the work that you're doing and know that you are willing to converse with them, to build relationships in the classroom? I say this because high school age students are looking for meaning in their lives. They want to do real things, they want to see themselves as change agents. This makes See, Judge, Act a highly appropriate methodology for their stage of development. Moreover, if formed well at this age, research suggests that these young people will persist in their civic participation at a much higher rate than students who have not been immersed in such an empathetic process. An anecdotal review of my students in the year following this project would seem to support this research. One student pursued an unpaid summer internship with DOJPC, continuing her work on Tyra's case. A large portion of students were persistent throughout the following school year in making inquiries about the status of Tyra's case and her personal well-being. Several students exhibited leadership behaviors around new justice concerns. They planned all-school marches, a school-wide prayer service, all-school seminars, ideas which had never been modeled by previous classes. This suggests that students learn to see themselves as change agents with both the responsibility and the power to have an impact in the broader community. This ultimately is what I think we're called by our faith to do. To love one another as Christ loved us, making the choice to encounter our neighbors in need, to discern our power and responsibility in light of our faith, and act to meet the needs of our neighbors, whether through direct ministry or advocacy for systemic changes. See, Judge, Act. We can and we should equip our youth with knowledge of this methodology and mentor them in its application. See, Judge, Act offers a vehicle for Catholic high school religious education in a particular way to increase its long-term impact by developing curricula that ask students to do more than memorize morality. We can and we should invite young people to actually live it. Thank you.
Katie's students are very, very lucky and blessed to have her. So I really want to thank her. A lot of what she said resonated with me as I was a former high school religious teacher myself. And I think I have a lot to learn myself from Katie. Next we have Kareem Joseph Murad, who received his PhD in mathematical logic from the University of Chicago. He has taught at the University of Singapore and recently at Georgetown in our nation's capital. And he is currently involved in Cardine Associates and conducting independent research. And he is here today to talk to us about the See, Judge, Act and spirituality. So please welcome him to the podium.